Hey everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of discussions on the internet and technology and progress and some of the social issues that we face. We've done a number of these this year, focused on topics ranging from regulation to journalism to biomedical research. And today we're going to focus on a discussion around what progress is itself and how we might study it, and what academic work is already going on in this space, and what we might think about to look at examples from the past to determine how we can make more progress for humanity going forward. So today joining me is Tyler Cowan, who studies economics at George Mason University and is also the co-author of the popular blog Marginal Revolution, and Patrick Collison, who's the co-founder and CEO of Stripe, which is a pretty amazing company that basically does payments and economic infrastructure for the internet. So, we've been talking about these topics for a while now. I mean, this is something that you guys have both studied in a lot of depth, and you recently wrote an op-ed together. I think it was in the Atlantic, about how we might have a new or different approach for studying the nature of progress, and in order to kind of mine historical examples to figure out how we can make more progress in the future. So I think it would probably be interesting just to start off by hearing how you're thinking about that, and the basic summary and what feedback you've gotten on the piece that you wrote.
Sure. So I think one of the most important sort of facts in the world and sort of the history of civilization to date is that the rate of progress has not been constant, right? If you look at sort of what happened in the world, say between 0 and 1700, 1800, thereabouts, the rate of progress by sort of any major metric in terms of average income or average life expectancy or infant mortality, any of these measures, it was either sort of constant or only very improving at a very slow rate, right? And then something happened, something changed around sort of 1700, 1750, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, some sort of the advent of kind of something approximating modern science. And once that happened, so many things started to get better together, right? Again, incomes improved, life expectancies increased. We started to discover really fundamental knowledge about the world. We started to invent really important new technologies, and these things have, over the last couple of centuries, really diffused around the world, right? So that's very interesting and important. And the intuition, I think, and the thing that sort of really struck or has been sort of a focus of both of ours for the past couple of years is thinking about, well, we sort of transitioned from this regime where we weren't making much progress to one where we have been making much more. Is this the best we can do, right? Or is there something that looks, compared to the status quo today, so much better again that it's sort of like the status quo ex ante, before the Industrial Revolution? And as you look around the world today, on the one hand, we see the tremendous importance of the progress that we are generating, right? And that, for example, the number of people in extreme poverty has declined by more than 1 billion people since I was born. But on the other hand, there's a lot of suggestive evidence that maybe we aren't as effective at generating progress today as we have been in the past. And so, for example, if you look at the U.S., sort of productivity growth mid-century, or say between 1920 and 1970, was maybe about sort of 1.9% a year. Now most economists think it's much lower, maybe around sort of 0.4% a year, something like that. So we're at least by economic measures generating progress more slowly than we used to be. Now, whatever the rate at which we're kind of making progress or sort of figuring out ways to do things better today, whatever that absolute level is, it would be much better if we were doing it more effectively, if we were able to solve the most important problems that face us today in 50 years and 100 years rather than 500 years or 1,000 years, right? And so the meta question that we're really interested in is how does progress happen? How do we discover useful knowledge? How is that diffused? And how can we do it better?
It's important to understand, I think, how much this is an invisible crisis. So if you have a growth rate that is 1 percentage point lower, over the course of a bit more than a century, you could have been 3 times richer with the higher growth rate. That would be something like the difference between the United States today and Mexico. So by having a lower rate of productivity growth, in no given year does it feel that bad. But 2-3 generations later, you're much worse off. It's harder to pay off your debts, harder to solve climate change, harder to address a whole host of problems.
Yeah. So, before we kind of dive into how we could improve this, what do you say to the people who question whether all this progress is positive? I mean, certainly as we make progress in one area, it creates issues in other areas. I mean, that's been a big topic that I focused on in my work at Facebook over the last few years, and a lot of these challenge discussions. But how does that fit into the overall framework of what you're studying in this discipline here?
I don't think economic growth is always a positive, but the world in America has serious problems. I would rather address those problems with more resources rather than fewer, whether it is paying off our debts, addressing climate change, fixing global poverty. And knowledge matters too. So there's a recent paper by Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, and they find if you give foreign aid combined with coaching, the rate of return to that intervention is maybe 100 to 400%. Now that may or may not be true, but what I would like to see is a world where everyone is obsessing over that claim, over that debate, working very hard to figure out that it's true. That should be on the front page. People should be talking about it, calling up their siblings. My goodness, I just read this. What are we going to do? Do you agree or not?
Yeah, and look, while again, I think it's sort of unequivocally the case that sort of certain kinds of progress in certain places, or to a certain extent, can have harms and externalities and all the rest. And a really important part of progress is figuring out how do we mitigate those, how do we solve them, and so on. And I think climate change is probably kind of the foremost global example today. But I think it's really important, or it is easy for sort of us sitting here in the Bay Area in California, I think, to undervalue the prosperity and the kind of wealth that we've been able to generate over the past couple, 100 years. And so, since I was born, for example, global life expectancy has increased by about 6 years. Infant mortality has fallen by more than 50%. Again, I mentioned the statistic about the number of people who have left extreme poverty. This is incredibly important, right? And so I think there's we're not the first people to say it, but there is a moral imperative to this kind of progress, and we shouldn't lose sight of that fact.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important. A lot of these things are not uniform, and I mean, from running a company that when you look at averages and anything, it hides a lot of issues. I mean, your example on the rates of poverty going down, I think, is an interesting one in this because, what a lot of people don't particularly want to talk about these days is that most of the benefit of people coming out of poverty has happened in China, and a lot of other places around the world, in some places, poverty has actually increased. So it's, I generally agree with the premise and I think studying this stuff will generally help us to make more progress in those places. I mean, that may be a good example because perhaps looking at some of the examples of what has done well in China could be applied to other places where there have been issues. But before we dive into the discussion on this, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't cover this in a way that comes across as if like every step forward it comes without a cost. And I'm sure as we talk through the different examples, I mean that'll come up as well.
Yeah, well, and we should emphasize that when we sort of talk about the phenomenon of progress, I think GDP or GDP per capita is a sort of pretty good first approximation measure of it, and it correlates strongly with many of the things I think we care about. But they're definitely not the same thing. And I think an important question for anybody kind of interested in this area to think about is, well, how should we define progress, right? And what are the better and worse kinds of it? And again, in GDP, we kind of have a relatively effective metric we can use across countries, but there already is interesting work on what might better measures be, and I think that's really important to study.
Well, let's say you want to improve the lot of people in West Virginia. One growth-enhancing way of doing that is to make it easier to build, say in Washington, D.C., in the Bay Area. Right now, to move from West Virginia, say, to Menlo Park, it's extraordinarily expensive. You can't just pick up and show up here and hope to get a job washing dishes the way one might have done in America 50 years ago. So by having more building, more economic growth, also more GDP, it would increase more opportunity. So economic growth and opportunity, they do tend to be correlated. And sometimes the problem is we don't have enough growth, not that we have too much.
Mm-hmm. And look, not to hammer this point too strongly, but you did invite the two people who wrote the piece about progress here.
Yeah, and I would spend most of the time actually talking about that. I just wanted to make sure that we hit that up front. Yeah. So what are you, when you're talking about there are a lot of people who already are studying this in different ways, right? There are historians, economists. When you're thinking about what the field is, when you're talking about trying to create a new science of studying progress, what more do you think needs to get done, or what do you envision on that? I mean, I know you have a fund that you've put together, Emerging Ventures.
Emerging Ventures,
and,
yes.
And where you're basically finding academics who are studying examples of where there's of progress in the past to start this field. But what does this kind of add up to, or how do you think, what form does this take over time?
One view of mine is that not enough philanthropy is long-term oriented. In this regard, I've been influenced by your Chan Zuckerberg initiative. And also in philanthropy, there are too many choke points that can say no. So foundations become their own bureaucracies. They become very risk averse. So emergent ventures is a new kind of philanthropy. There's one layer of yes or no. People are encouraged to apply. If the payoff is 30, 40 years down the road, the attitude is great. Take a lot of chances. Worry about getting some winners and some risk, and not expecting the median project to be something that necessarily looks good when taken to a board. So that's one way that thinking in terms of progress helps us restructure at the micro level particular decisions we're making.
Yeah.
Strongly agree that sort of there's a lot of really important work already happening across multiple disciplines that is relevant to these questions. And part of what the idea of there being a new science of progress, that's not sort of quite that was the headline placed on the article, but sort of not exactly what we were saying. What we were arguing is that the work that's already happening should be receiving more attention, and there should be much more of it. And so just to give us a couple of quick examples, there's strongly suggestive evidence that we can teach management practices such that people can run firms more effectively, right? And so there's a couple of studies on this. There's a good one from some folks at Stanford. They did sort of a randomized trial in India, and there's a really neat one that came out I think last year from Michele Giorcelli, looking at firms in Italy and showing that over 15 years after sort of, again, a management training program with sort of some natural randomization, that again those firms were employing more people, paying more wages, being more successful. And another randomized trial in Mexico conducted over the past couple of years, again 600 firms, and showing that just teaching better management practices actually makes those companies much better off. If that's true, that's amazing low-hanging fruit, right? We should be investing much more in this area. We should be figuring out which kinds of management training work better and worse than others. Is this generalized to all countries? How can we actually implement and execute this in the world more broadly? So that's kind of one. Second is, if you take Tyler mentioned this point about sort of geographic mobility, right? When you think about sort of how do we grow GDP or how do we generate progress, maybe kind of housing policy is not kind of the first thing we're naturally drawn to thinking about. However, if you look at the world in say the USA in 1980, about 40% of people when they took a new job moved somewhere else, right? So, those things went together much more. If you look last year, about 1 in 10 people moved when they took a new job, right? And so within the US, geographic mobility has really declined. That is in large part because the costs of movement have enormously increased as housing costs have increased, especially in our most productive regions over the past couple of decades. Now, if you look into that sort of more closely, again, there are sort of economists who've been studying these questions quite closely over the past couple of years. These two guys, Shea and Moretti, published a paper, an updated version of a previous paper this summer, claiming or kind of putting forward a model showing that if you look at the zoning restrictions that existed in the Bay Area and New York between 1964 and 2009, and you kind of imagine a counterfactual world where there was sort of much more supply elasticity in these places, we built way more homes here in the Bay Area and in New York. And in that counterfactual world, average US income would be, in their model, $3,700 per person higher. Again, not just for people in those places, but across the country, right? That's a huge effect size. And so again, we should be studying these questions much more closely, and we should be figuring out, okay, well, if that's true, what are the policy prescriptions? How do we actually go act upon that? It's amazing low-hanging fruit. And then just to give a third one, as those two examples show, funding science is incredibly important, but there's surprisingly little work about how we should be funding science and how can we do that most effectively. And actually, sort of beneath the surface, it's been changing a tremendous amount, here in the US over the past couple of decades. And there for important policy questions. Is that a good thing? And so, for example, in 1980, 12x more dollars, or the NIH spent 12x more dollars on researchers under 40 than researchers over 50. So they predominantly funded younger people. Today, they spend 5x more dollars on people over 50 than under 40. And so it's really inverted. It's kind of gone from primarily funding these young investigators to this kind of gerontocracy where they're funding older scientists. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know, but that seems like a very important question to answer. And so part of our point in arguing for progress studies is when you really look at the kind of the expansive version of this, of all the different things that can sort of influence our ability to discover new useful knowledge, to generate economic growth, the set of questions is super broad, and we should be trying to kind of synthesize this effectively.
Yeah, so let's go deep on medical research here for a second, because I think this is an area that you wrote this paper about before, about how the progress in the field might be slowing. And like you mentioned, I mean, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, the philanthropy that I run with my wife, I mean, a big focus of it is on medical research and trying to, we have this aspirational goal that we want to help build tools that can help scientists cure, prevent, or manage all diseases by the end of this century. And basically the math of how you get there is, starting about 100 years ago, call it, there was really this uptick in medical research where we started doing randomized control experiments, treating it more like an experimental science. Since around that time, the average life expectancy has increased by a quarter of a year every year, relatively linearly. There's no guarantee, of course, that continues, but if we were able to have that continue, then that would imply that by the end of the century, we will generally have had to have either cure, prevent, or be able to manage most, if not all, of the diseases that we're aware of now. So there's some trend that suggests that this should be reasonable, and the approach that we're taking in the work at CZI is largely about building tools to help compound the rate of science. So what we see is that, like you mentioned, the government is the largest and most important funder of science, and it basically funds the whole establishment of scientists across the country. But the grants tend to be very spread out across a lot of people. They're not typically put into kind of big infrastructure projects, and that's the niche that we've felt through CZI that we can maybe help to fill, is investing, instead of $1 million in a lab, put $100 million or a couple $100 million over time into building up really important scientific assets for the community, like helping to fund scientists to go put together this human cell atlas, almost like the you can kind of think about it as it's almost like the periodic table of elements, but for biology, of all the different kinds of cells in the human body. And the goal is just, if you look throughout the history of science, at least, most major scientific breakthroughs have been preceded by the invention of new tools that help people look at things in different ways. And so the theory is kind of similar to what you're going at, of how do you increase the compounding rate of progress. But there are a couple of different directions that I think we could go in here. I mean, one is, I'm curious what you've seen in your studies in the space that suggest to you that the rate of progress is actually slowing. And I'm also curious, what are the examples that you've seen overall of how the science around studying progress would potentially lead to a different approach or a different portfolio of how this kind of work gets done. So I don't know where you want to start with that, but there's a lot here to do.
Here's what worries me, and it should worry you too. So as you mentioned, U.S. life expectancy is basically going up in linear fashion. But if you look at expenditures, we used to spend a few percentage points of GDP on healthcare, and now it's about 18%. So we've gone up to 18%, and we're not even boosting the rate. I'm not saying it's the fault of any one group of people, but something has gone wrong. There's some kind of last mile problem. You can turn to the newspapers and read all kinds of fantastic stories, new research, new ideas, new tools. But when the rubber hits the road, people living longer, we're spending more and more and more for exactly the same returns. So if that trend continues, and you see a similar trend in many areas, also crop yields, feeding the world, other areas, the question becomes, where does all the progress go? So the idea that you need to look at each structure and encourage more risk-taking, better decisions with the money, less bureaucratization, maybe in some cases more centralization, whatever it takes, but that there is this invisible crisis and people are distracted by the headlines about CRISPR, whatever, but actually what you get for the money, performance is so-so, I think.
Yeah, and so what we wrote in this article a year ago about sort of what's going on in science, if you look at it by sort of the most kind of macroscopic measures, right? Like the number of PhDs in the US, like kind of active PhDs, has grown by well, actually you take all the macroscopic measures, they've all grown by about a factor between of 50 and 100, right? Number of PhDs, number of papers published every year, just like actual dollars instead of science funding and so on. So if in a sort of very stylized way, if we look at sort of the first half of the 20th century as compared to the second half, just like way more kind of input in the second half of the century. And again, not by kind of 50%, but by kind of orders of magnitude. And so then I think the question for all of us would be, well, in which half of the century did we get more out in terms of kind of useful scientific knowledge, and whichever we think kind of did better, to what degree, right? And again, that's a very difficult question to answer. How do you weigh kind of scientific knowledge? And so you have to kind of look at it, I think, in sort of various applied contexts, like life expectancy, or semiconductors, or as Tyler mentioned, crop yields, or whatever. And I think what's interesting and should be concerning is that for almost every conceivable sort of applied measure, we seem to be getting at best constant returns. But that's really bad because we've exponentially increasing inputs and we've constant return outputs. Like that is kind of almost by definition sort of not a process that we can sustain. Now there's two, I think, broad possibilities there. One is it's just getting intrinsically harder to generate progress and to kind of discover these things. And who knows, maybe some significant amount of that is true. But the other possibility is it's somehow more institutional, right? It's more kind of contingent. It's more sociological. And again, we do have suggestive evidence that our institutions are. Well, they're certainly kind of older than they used to be, and they're also kind of, as in the kind of NIH funding example, there are changes happening beneath the surface and so on that may or may not be good. So I don't think we should write off the possibility that it's actually it's not inevitable, and that there is or that there do exist alternate forms of organization where things would work better. And again, if we sort of dig a little bit into the evidence there, you see things like so there's a science funding program that obviously you're familiar with called HMI, the Howard Hughes kind of Medical Institute. If they give grants sort of along the lines of sort of how CCI does, where they're longer term, they're kind of more open ended and so on. Pierre Azoulay at MIT wrote a paper a couple of years ago and trying to look at well, if you take ostensibly identical scientists who some of whom receive HMI grants, some of whom don't, how much more successful are the HMI recipients? And he concluded they're about twice as likely to produce a kind of top 1% paper by citation count. Again, that's really suggestive.
They're top 1% if they do what?
They're about twice as likely to produce a top 1% paper by citation count.
If they
if they receive an HMI grant.
Well, that might be correlation, not causation.
Yeah, so he tries to control.
They do get a lot of the best people.
Yeah. So he tries to control for that, and he's a reasonable methodology for it. But some of it could totally be sort of that just selection effect. But again, I think it's very suggestive that maybe there are things we could do that would better enable this kind of discovery. And this might seem like sort of a bit of a red herring, but I think it is kind of again suggestive. That in many other domains where we can objectively assess progress, it's very clear that our productivity has fallen off a cliff, and for reasons that we can be pretty sure are not that it's getting intrinsically harder. And so, for example, when New York decided to build the subway in 1900, right? They decided to build it. 4.7 years later, they opened 23 subway stations, and in 2019 dollars, they spent just over $1 billion doing so, right? So 23 stations, just over $1 billion. When New York decided to build the Second Avenue subway in year 2000, 17 years later, they opened 3 stations, and they spent $4.5 billion doing so, right? And so kind of our productivity in subway construction has, at least in New York, decreased by a factor of 40. Here in the Bay Area, we decided to build the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge starting in 1933. Both projects finished within 4 years, and then to celebrate it, we decided to build a man-made island, and we built that island in 18 months. I haven't tried, but I would wager that if one tried to build a new island in San Francisco, it would be difficult to do so today, in 18 months. And so and I mean, California, you have high-speed rail, where when France decided to build, the TGV, it's high-speed rail. It opened the first line after 5 years. California started pursuing high-speed rail 11 years ago. We forecast being finished in 2033. So we project a 25-year project, but of course that's a projection. It'll probably end up being much longer still, right? So, this is a domain where it's hard to imagine that the building infrastructure has gotten intrinsically harder, right? Like the atoms aren't physically heavier than they used to be, right? And so clearly there's something institutional, sociological going on with infrastructure. Larry Summers talks about the idea of the sort of promiscuous distribution of the veto power, and just how much harder it is to sort of get things done. In as much as that's true, then there's the question of, well, have other institutions, have other sort of progress-generating mechanisms in our society, have they also got less efficient? And if so, what can we do about it?
So as an aside, if you're watching this, Patrick collects these examples of projects, historical projects that went fast and that you can't imagine how they went that fast. So if you Google his website, he has like a whole list of these that I think is pretty interesting and compelling when you go through all of them.
Yeah, I think it's just important to understand how effectively we as a species, how effectively we can do things when we're organized the right way. Humanity is pretty amazing, and when possibilities are unlocked, when efficacy is enabled, we can do great things.
Sometimes it is a matter of actual will. Mm-hmm. So for the last 40 years, getting around for almost all Americans, it is slower. And before that, we had a period from 1800, say, to 1970, when it got quicker and quicker and quicker. And now even flying in airplanes for most people is slower. Traffic is worse. Those are solvable problems. Manhattan should have congestion pricing and a stiffer form of it than they're likely to opt for. So the notion that people have lost the ability to imagine a future much different and much better than what they know, to me, is one of the most worrying aspects of where we are now.
Yeah.